Let's head now to the central west of New South Wales, where recent flooding has contaminated Dubbo's water supply. It's a big issue. It's left the city of more than 43,000 residents without drinking water. So a boil water alert's been in place for 5 days after flooding in the Macquarie River. Earlier this week, the Mayor of Dubbo, Matthew Dickerson, said the alert would be lifted, but in a staged approach. And Matthew Dickerson joins us now. Good morning. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, good morning, Tom. Good to be chatting to you.
Firstly, can you explain how this happened? What impact the flooding had?
Well, actually, it's quite relevant that you had Anthony Albanese just speaking then about climate change and the reality of that. I think we'll see more things like this happening as we go forward. Obviously, we go back a couple of years, Tom, we had a terrible drought throughout the whole region, and that obviously impacts water supplies and what we can do with water. And then on the back of that, you then get to the stage where we've got this flooding event now. And I don't really call it a flood as such because we're not like the towns underwater, but the river was certainly up to a much higher level than normal. We had to close a couple of pedestrian bridges, but the roadways were still okay. But what that does when you get that type of flood event is you're dragging a lot of debris from the sides of the river down into the water stream. So, for example, you've got fecal matter from animals, you've got carcasses from animals, and there's probably more of that debris on the sides of the river because of the drought we had a couple of years ago, so there are more animals that might have died during that process. One of the rivers in particular that feeds into the Macquarie River, called the Little River, wasn't a little river for a few days, it was a very big river for a few days, and it's higher than I've ever seen that particular river, even when we go back, say, 10 or 12 years to some higher floods. So again, more of that is brought down. And I'm going to use a term, Tom, that I never thought I'd need to use, and it's a term I only learnt about a week or so ago, is turbidity. The water had a much higher turbidity level. In fact, the correct term is the nephthalmetric turbidity unit was much higher in the water that was being brought down the river. And so then we take that water out of the river to our water treatment plant, and we obviously treat that water, get it to the point where it's safe for drinking. And there's a very blunt measure that's in place, and it's only something that's been introduced over the last decade around the actual water that we produce. And if we can produce water consistently under 0.5, and that's the turbidity level, NTUs, then that's considered to be safe. If it goes over 0.5, what can happen then is you can be hiding some pathogens in that water. And the turbidity that comes out of our water treatment is really just how clear it is. But if you think, well, you'd probably be able to see that, you need to get up to a level of about 5 NTUs before it even looks a little bit cloudy. So measuring it at 0.5 or around that level, it's not something you can pick up with the eye. Obviously, we've got instrumentation to monitor that. We found about a week ago that the level went to 0.52. We've got processes in place, protocols in place that as soon as it's above 0.5, we've got some mechanisms that trigger. That includes notifying New South Wales Health. That includes different processes in our plant. And we found for a couple of hours of testing there, we could keep it around 0.5, 0.52, 0.48. But under advice from New South Wales Health, we went through a few other processes. Then finally last Thursday, we issued a boil water alert to say to the community, it's still unlikely there's something wrong, but to be safe, just boil the water if you're going to consume the water, and that's where we've been. Now,
as a precaution, yeah. Now, you've said the alert's going to be lifted in a staged approach. How's that going to work, Matthew, and when does it start?
Yeah, so I can't tell you when it starts because we're still working on that with New South Wales Health. We produced water that might have been around that 0.5 level for about 10 hours. In that 10 hours, we were feeding that water out into our reservoir network. We've got a number of reservoirs around the city that feed out different areas of the city. We then, after that 10 hours, got to the stage where we were confident it was back to the levels we'd like to see it, which is about 0.2 NTUs. And so that's been filling those reservoirs since then, and they've been being used. Then we're going through a range of complicated mathematical calculations to work out when the dilution level in our reservoirs is below 0.1% of that potential contaminated water that was in the reservoir. So you can imagine lots of people sitting around with lots of expertise, crunching lots of numbers to come up with that. The way we'll then stage that will be our 3 main reservoirs that our water treatment plant feeds into will be the first ones, the first areas where the zones, if you like, that are fed by those will be lifted. And then reservoirs that are downstream from those reservoirs will be delayed by a few days to get to that point where New South Wales Health and Department of Public Works, we've got involved here as well, and our own staff are confident that there is minimal risk to the community.
The water's safe. Yeah, I mean, on that note, so as you say, a staged approach and a lot's going into this by the sounds of it, lots of numbers there. How have people been coping with it over the past week, Matthew? Have you had sort of is there an understanding in the community and people doing the right thing in boiling the water?
Yeah, I think people are good. And obviously with something like this, the most important thing from my perspective, from council's perspective, is getting it out there to the community. And the media have been very good. They've been very helpful in making sure we can get that information out there. I think I was on the local ABC radio station within about 20 minutes of when the boil water alert went out. So the information has gotten out there. Essentially, all I've done is I've apologised to the community. It's not good enough that we aren't treating the water to a drinkable level. That's one of the things that we should be able to do, and we should have a community with confidence that we can do that. But more importantly, this is a health issue. So yes, I apologise, but here is what everyone needs to do to make sure they stay healthy. And people have been responding to that. People have been communicating, certainly with myself and with council, and telling people what they've been doing to make sure they're okay. We communicated with the supermarkets to say maybe it's a good idea to get some additional bottled water in. They did that. So you walk into most supermarkets now, there's some pallets at the beginning of the supermarket there with lots of bottled water. And so the community, I mean, it's not great. Obviously, people would prefer not to be boiling their water, but the community has responded and the community is doing what it's got to do and is accepting of the fact that yes, it's not perfect, it's not ideal, but the most important thing is council's communicating, telling us what's happening and giving us regular updates about actually what's going on.
Well, good on you for all the best for the road ahead, and thanks very much for joining us this morning. Hope you can get back to not having to boil the water soon. Appreciate your time, Matthew.
Thank you, Tom.
That's Matthew Dickinson there, the Mayor of Dubbo in the New South Wales Central West. So that alert, as Matthew says at the moment, just with that turbidity of the water being tested, if you're in that area, that boil water alert now been in place for 5 days after flooding.